The morning sky over western France was gray. When Oberleutnant Karl Henning first heard the distant hum, it wasn't German. The sound was heavier, slower, the kind that filled the air like thunder rolling across the fields. He raised his binoculars and saw it, a four-engine giant limping low across the horizon, smoke trailing from one wing. The radio crackled. Unidentified heavy bomber heading east, altitude 800 meters. Likely American. By the end of 1942, the Allies had begun sending their massive daylight bombers deep into occupied Europe. The Americans called it precision bombing. The Luftwaffe called it madness. But this B-17 flying fortress, was alone, wounded, and descending fast. Henning's unit, part of a forward Luftwaffe repair detachment, watched as the bomber dropped its landing gear and touched down hard on a field outside Bourges. The impact tore through the earth, but the aircraft didn't explode. Its engine sputtered, then died. The local soldiers approached cautiously, rifles ready. When they opened the hatch, they found a scene frozen in exhaustion. 10 American airmen, some bleeding, one dead, the rest too shocked to resist. What mattered most wasn't the men, it was the machine. The B-17F was almost intact. Inside were its radio systems, gun turrets, Norden bomb sight, and, most astonishingly, every .50 caliber gun still in place. A fortress that had fallen whole into German hands. Within days, the bomber was transported to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing center north of Berlin. Mechanics carefully replaced damaged engines with parts from captured stocks. Allied markings were painted over with black crosses. Engineers took notes, pilots walked around it in silence. Henning had flown everything from the Ju-88 to the He-111, but as he climbed into the cockpit of the American machine for the first time, he felt something else: space, visibility, logic. The controls were heavy but smooth. The cockpit layout was designed for endurance, not speed. Americanish engineer, they built this to survive, muttered his flight engineer, Feldwebel Kruger. Karl nodded. It's a flying fortress in every sense. Over the next days, teams from the Luftwaffe's research division swarmed over the plane. They logged its gun positions, firing arcs, and armor protection. There were machine guns in every direction: nose, tail, belly, top turret, and sides. To attack such a thing head-on, Henning realized, was suicide. By January 1943, the order came. The B-17 would fly again, this time under German control. Its new code name was DL+XC. The Reich wanted to understand its strengths, its weaknesses, and maybe even use it for deception missions with Kilogram 200. Henning volunteered to be among the first to fly it. When asked why, he simply said, "To know your enemy, you must sit in his cockpit." As the ground crew cleared the runway, the engines roared to life. For deep-throated cyclones shaking the frosty morning air, Henning eased the throttles forward, and the massive machine began to roll. For a brief moment, he wasn't a German pilot or an American target. He was simply a man at the controls of one of the most remarkable aircraft ever built. A machine born for war, now flying for the other side. The test flight was about to begin. The airfield at Rechlin was silent, except for the echo of four roaring engines. Mechanics in gray overalls stood watching, as Oberleutnant Karl Henning guided the American giant down the runway. It was a strange sight, the familiar Balkan crews painted on a plane that, only weeks before, had bombed the Ruhr. DL+XC airborne, Henning reported calmly. The B-17 lifted off with a steadiness that surprised everyone. There was no violent torque, no tremor. The aircraft climbed like a ship rising on the sea. Compared to the Heinkel bombers Henning had flown, this was something else, solid, almost gentle. Flies like a cathedral, Kruger said through the intercom. Heavy, but it doesn't fight you. At 5,000 meters, they leveled off. German engineers in the cabin took readings: control pressure, fuel efficiency, oxygen use. Henning's hands rested easily on the throttles. Every gauge, every switch was within reach, a pilot's machine, built for long hours in thin air. Then came the real test: defensive positions. Luftwaffe gunners climbed into each station, the tail turret, the top, the ball under the belly. Henning banked slightly, giving them angles to test visibility and arcs of fire. From above, the B-17 looked bristling, guns at every angle, each overlapping the next. It wasn't the power of one weapon that mattered, but the web of protection they formed. An approach from 6 o'clock is almost impossible, one of the gunners noted. 2 Brownings in the tail, 2 from the top turret, 2 from the waist. They can crossfire everything behind them. Henning smiled thinly. He thought about the young Luftwaffe pilots who tried to attack these fortresses head-on, or from the rear, and never came back. Now he understood why. After landing, the test crew gathered around a table inside the hangar. Schematics were spread out, angles of approach, bullet trajectories, armor thickness. "It is not fast," said Hauptmann Voss from the test division. "But look at its concept, endurance, firepower, stability. This aircraft is built like a machine gun nest in the sky." Someone asked if such heavy armament was really necessary. Henning looked up from his notes. "It's not about necessity," he said. "It's about survival. Every crewman on this ship knows his part of the defense. It makes them fight harder." For the next weeks, the aircraft was flown again and again, sometimes under escort of Messerschmitt fighters, sometimes alone. They studied not only how it flew, but how it bled. Mock attacks were staged. Tracer rounds fired near the fuselage to map blind spots. Each time, Henning came down from the cockpit with the same thought. This isn't a bomber. It's a fortress that just happens to fly. By March 1943, word of the tests had spread through the Luftwaffe. Pilots at the front were briefed using photos from Rechlin, showing where the B-17's defenses overlapped and where they didn't. A small corner of advantage, the frontal cone near the cockpit, became the standard attack vector for German interceptors. Henning was commended for his work, but privately, he told Kruger one night over weak beer in the officers' mess, "They say it's just a machine, but I sat inside it, and it feels alive. You can sense the men who built it." Kruger nodded. "And the ones who fly it." Henning stared out the window, where the strange, hybrid bomber, American Soul, German markings rested under the hangar lights. For the first time in the war, he felt something unfamiliar, admiration for the enemy's craft. By the spring of 1943, the B-17 in Rechlin was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a teaching tool. Crews of the Luftwaffe's fighter command came to study it, to learn its secrets before facing it in the skies over Germany. Oberleutnant Karl Henning had become something of a specialist. Whenever new Jagdgeschwader pilots arrived for instruction, he stood before them in his flight jacket, pointing at diagrams on the blackboard. "This is where you die," he said, tracing a line toward the tail of the bomber. "Never attack from behind. If you must, approach from above or from 1 o'clock. Fast, short burst, and break off." The young pilots nodded, some with respect, others with disbelief. They had all heard the stories. B-17 formations that spat fire in every direction. Bombers that refused to fall even after taking 100 hits. To demonstrate, Henning led them to the hangar. The captured bomber sat gleaming under floodlights. A strange mix of stars and crosses painted over each other. Scars from its previous life still visible. He climbed inside with them, showing the crew positions one by one. The navigator's cramped desk, the radio operator's station humming with equipment, and the gunner's sphere under the fuselage. The ball turret, small enough to crush a man with fear. "Americans designed this machine to make every man feel as protecting the others," Henning explained. "That's its secret. Not just the steel, the spirit." In the following days, the Luftwaffe staged mock intercepts. Bf-109s and Fw-190s dove and weaved around the American machine, while observers recorded firing angles and approach speeds. Even when flown by Germans, the B-17's defensive arcs forced attackers to maneuver carefully, proof that it was sheer luck, keeping Allied bombers alive over the Reich. Then came an unusual order from Berlin. The aircraft was to be transferred to Kilogramm 200, the Luftwaffe's secret operations unit. There, under heavy security, it would be repainted once again, this time in American colors. Henning didn't understand the full plan, but rumors spread. Infiltration missions, reconnaissance, perhaps even attempts to join Allied formations to confuse them. It sounded insane, but in 1943, desperation had become strategy. Before the transfer, Henning took the aircraft for one last flight. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of spring rain. He leveled out at 4,000 meters and trimmed the controls. The engines purred evenly, steady, confident, uncomplaining. He spoke softly into his mask. Whoever designed you, they knew what they were fighting for. When he landed, he removed his gloves and placed them on the throttle levers. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a message, one he couldn't quite explain. Weeks later, the B-17 was gone, flown under secrecy to Finsterwald for conversion. Henning never saw it again. But the lessons it taught him about engineering, about courage, about the strange respect between enemies, would stay with him long after the skies of Europe burned with fire. Finsterwald Air Base was unlike any other place Henning had seen. There were guards at every gate, no unit insignias on uniforms. and every aircraft seemed to belong to someone else's air force. Among the rows of Focke-Wulfs and Ju-88s stood foreign silhouettes, Liberators, flying fortresses, even AP-51 with its stars painted over. This was KG-200, the Luftwaffe's most secretive wing, the place where captured machines were reborn for missions that officially did not exist. Henning had been reassigned here after his work at Rechlin. His familiarity with the American bomber made him a natural candidate. When he first saw the Wolfhound again, he barely recognized it. The aircraft had been repainted in authentic U.S. markings, olive drab, white stars, and serial numbers meticulously copied from wreckage photographs. Only a trained eye would notice the faint shadow of the old Bakken cruise beneath the paint. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, the operations officer, briefed him in a windowless room. "Your role is simple," he said. "You will fly this aircraft in formation with Allied bombers for training purposes, identification, deception drills, possibly reconnaissance." He paused. "If you are ever mistaken for the enemy, you will not survive." Henning only nodded. The irony of it wasn't lost on him, a German officer, about to fly under the flag of the enemy he had studied so carefully. During the first simulation, the tension was unbearable. From a distance, even friendly German pilots hesitated before recognizing the radio codes and formation signals. The American design was flawless in its familiarity, its massive tail, and for propellers moved with that steady, confident rhythm that had terrified German cities for months. "Imagine the confusion if this thing appeared over England," Kruger muttered during a break. "They'd wave at us before realizing." Henning didn't answer. For him, the aircraft was no longer a trophy. It was a mirror reflecting both sides of a war that had grown beyond reason. After several weeks, KG-200 began preparing for something more ambitious. The plan, though few knew the details, involved flying the captured bomber near Allied formations returning from missions over Germany. To approach, observe, perhaps jam radio frequencies or drop agents. Dangerous, even suicidal. Henning volunteered anyway. When asked why, he said quietly, "I've flown her longer than anyone. If anyone should take her up again, it's me." On the morning of the operation, the Wolfhound stood ready on the tarmac. The sun glinted off the false American markings, and for a moment, it looked like just another returning fortress. Henning climbed aboard, ran his gloved hand along the cold fuselage, and whispered, "Let's see if we can fool the sky itself." The engines roared to life, four deep, even tones blending into one, as the bomber lifted from the runway and climbed into the clouds. No one on the ground could tell which side it belonged to anymore. Somewhere ahead, real flying fortresses were already crossing the Rhine, homeward bound. Henning pointed the nose west. The morning haze above the Rhine shimmered with sunlight and contrails. From a distance, the sky looked peaceful, but Henning knew better. Somewhere ahead, hundreds of American bombers were returning from another daylight raid over the Ruhr. Their formation stretched for miles, tight and disciplined, like a slow-moving city in the clouds. In the cockpit of the Wolfhound, everything vibrated with tension. The radio was tuned to Allied frequencies. Fragments of English chatter crackled through the headset. "Lead group turning south, watch your spacing." The voices sounded tired, human. Kruger, sitting at the flight engineer's station, whispered, "They'll see us soon." Henning adjusted the trim and held course. "If we're lucky, they'll see one of their own." Below them, scattered puffs of flak marked the retreating formations. Soon, dark shapes appeared ahead, a line of flying fortresses glinting in the sun. Their silver skins flashed like mirrors, and their defensive guns moved restlessly, scanning the sky. "Distance 3 kilometers, Kruger said. "Closing." Henning throttled back slightly. The engines hummed evenly, a sound so perfect it made him uneasy. They approached from high above and behind, the classic position of an Allied straggler rejoining formation. Through the plexiglass canopy, Henning could see them clearly now, the same bombers he had studied for months, their tails painted with squadron codes he knew by heart. Men stood behind the guns, helmets glinting, scanning for threats. He could almost see their faces. For a moment, it worked. The formation adjusted to make space for the newcomer. No one fired. No alarm calls on the radio. The Wolfhound, once the enemy, flew again among its kin. But deception is a fragile thing. A waist gunner in the nearest fortress must have noticed something. Maybe the slightly darker paint, maybe the angle of the markings. A shimmer of movement, and suddenly the calm shattered. Contact. 9 o'clock. Odd markings. Tracer rounds tore through the air, white-hot lines streaking past the cockpit. Henning reacted instantly, diving and banking right. The heavy bomber groaned under the stress. "Hold her steady," Kruger shouted. "Too late," Henning muttered. "They know." The sky erupted with gunfire as several fortresses opened up. Henning pushed the throttles forward, the four cyclones roared in protest, and the B-17 dropped into a cloud bank. Bullets clanged off the fuselage, one shattered a window behind them. For minutes, they flew blind through the fog, instruments trembling. When they finally broke through, the sky was empty again. Only silence and the faint smell of credite in the air. Kruger exhaled slowly. "They nearly had us." Henning didn't answer. He looked out at the wings, at the bullet holes ripped through the metal, and thought of the American gunners firing at what they believed was an enemy, and they were right. He turned the aircraft east, back toward German lines. Behind them, the Allied formation drifted away into the horizon, a living wall of firepower, untouchable and relentless. As the engines droned on, Henning whispered, almost to himself, "They built something we can't match, not in strength, not in spirit." Kruger heard him but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. By early 1945, Germany was breaking apart. Airfields that once hummed with life now stood silent, littered with burned-out aircraft and empty fuel drums. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was a shadow of its former self. Oberleutnant Karl Henning sat in a cold barracks room at Finsterwald, staring at a faded photograph of the Wolfhound. The bomber no longer existed. It had been destroyed months earlier when Allied fighters swept over the base. During a transfer operation, one pass, one burst of tracer fire, and the machine that had crossed enemy skies under two flags was gone. Forever. Henning hadn't flown since. The high command still issued orders, but fuel was scarce, and even the bravest pilots knew the war was lost. Still, Henning remained on base, helping train the last desperate replacements, boys who barely knew how to start an engine, let alone fight in the air. At night, he walked along the empty hangars, his boots echoing on the concrete. He could almost hear the deep, steady rhythm of those four American engines, the sound that had once filled him with both awe and fear. To him, the captured fortress had become a symbol, not of victory, but of understanding. He remembered that first test flight, when he realized that the B-17 wasn't just a machine built for war, but for survival, for the belief that no crewman should ever fight alone. That idea had stayed with him. Germany's bombers were efficient, precise, deadly, but cold. The fortress had something else, humanity built into its steel. When the war finally ended, Henning surrendered to British forces. During questioning, one officer asked about the rumors, the captured bombers, the secret missions, the experiments. Henning confirmed what he could, then hesitated before adding quietly, "We studied your aircraft for months. We measured every plate, every gun, every system. But what we couldn't measure was the spirit of the men who flew it." The officer, and RAF veteran, said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why we won," he replied. Years later, Henning lived a quiet life in Hamburg. Sometimes, when planes passed high overhead, he'd look up and see chemtrails stretching across the blue, long, pale scars on the sky. He'd think of that winter morning at Rechlin, the smell of oil and frost, the first time he touched the controls of the captured bomber. He never glorified the war. He spoke of it only as a lesson that even in conflict, respect can survive between enemies who truly understand what they face. And when he closed his eyes, he still heard it, the steady heartbeat of four engines, carrying a fortress through fire, across nations, beyond flags, into history itself.